title of my presentation is I'll start my, the gender bias in the post-COVID economic recovery in Latin America. It's supposed to had a focus on the Argentinian case, but I changed a little the presentation, so the focus will be more regional. Well, public and external debts in Latin American countries has increased in the last decade, as we saw in many presentations earlier. And not only has increased, but also it got complex in terms of creditors. We have not only international financial organizations, but also private creditors and so on. During the pandemic, international financial organizations made available to Latin American countries the 2% of their GDPs annually in terms of liquidity, as we saw yesterday. And during the recovery, indicators related to debt over GDP improved in many countries, but because of the recovery of the GDPs, not the decreasing of the debts. And yet, they are still above over the pre-pandemic levels. Many countries in my region, in Latin America, are facing problems to meet payments and to renegotiate better conditions of these loans. And the most complicated cases are Ecuador, El Salvador, and Argentina. They have even restructured their debts with international financial organizations and also with private sectors. In the case of Argentina, as you may know, but you don't have to, of course, Argentina is currently under two different agreements with the IMF, a standby agreement and an extended facilities agreement. The IMF gave Argentina the largest loan in its history, in the history of the IMF, in 2018, which for many reasons, it was illegal and unpayable. This year, the government in March signed a renegotiation of that debt under an extended facilities agreement with which implies quarterly reviews by the IMF on the economy. So the aim of this presentation is explore the gendered impact of sovereign indebtedness in some Latin American countries. Some key concepts from feminist economics, as we saw with the earlier presentation. Orthodox economics tend to use the metaphor of the public debt as a household debt. They say a country's indebtedness is consequence to the fact that it's spending in excess over its income. So the first thing it should do is to cut those expenditures. And the definition of the sustainability of debt of orthodox economics is related with the capacity of repaying debts over time, essentially through fiscal consolidation, as they say. As we talked earlier with Jose, in recent years, even international organizations as the IMF include some gender narratives in their documents or in their public expositions, but these gender narratives are not mandatory and don't address structural issues. They are more expressions of good willness than conditionalities itself. Some heterodox perspectives change, not a little, a lot, the definition of sustainability of debt, and not only include fiscal consolidation or fiscal adjustment, but also incorporate external balance and the capacity of the economy to grow. From feminist, feminist economics present a very different definition of sustainability and turn the things upside down. And it focused on not the sustainability of debt, but the sustainability of people's lives at the center. And the main issue feminist economics says about that is, as with all other economic policy decisions, public debt are not gender neutral. And this is the main concept I would like to put here. During sovereign debt renegotiation processes, creditors usually demands two main things: zero fiscal deficit in relation to the country's GDPs and structural reforms for increased competitiveness. And none of these measures is gender neutral, because women and LGBT people are overrepresented in the poor population, in precarious conditions, and in the labor market, in social security, and in available time. So evidence has already been provided that sovereign indebtedness has generated impacts mainly through three channels: fiscal adjustment, the pattern of economic growth, and structural reforms. Regarding fiscal adjustment, we can all agree that it's not a virtuous thing to maintain fiscal deficits over the time, but the way we can reach that fiscal, zero deficit is everything. And the most common recommendation of international organizations during renegotiations processes has to do with reach fiscal adjustment through the increasing of indirect taxes and cutting social expenditures, etc. During 2020 and 2021, I mean, during in the middle of the pandemic, IMF recommended 138 countries to proceed with fiscal consolidation, omitting the spending needs associated with the pandemics. Fiscal adjustment can be achieved, as I said, by increasing taxes or reducing government expenditures. And neither of these two is gender neutral, and organizations' recommendations often include the options that hurt the women and LGBT people the most. Direct taxes are, as we know, are more progressive, and indirect taxes are more regressive, and not only in terms of income, but also in terms of gender, because women, as I said, are overrepresented over the poorer people. In Latin American countries, direct taxes represent 48% of total fiscal incomes, while in OECD countries, direct taxes represent 66% of total direct incomes. And indirect taxes, I mean, one main issue in Latin American countries that get impossible or more difficult to collect direct taxes is tax evasion, and the ones who evade are the ones that have the highest income, and those are the men. On the other hand, indirect taxes, I don't have a graph of this, but indirect taxes in Latin American countries represent 49% of total incomes, of total tax incomes, while in OECD countries represent 28%. And women spend a higher proportion of their income on consumer goods. IMF tend to recommend introducing or expanding VAT by increasing the tax base or decreasing the exceptions, and there are fewer recommendations for countries to increase direct taxes. Regarding to public spending, during 2020 and 2021, IMF recommended to many countries reduce health expenditures, and that affects women in terms of access to sexual and reproductive health attention, increase the burden of care work, and women and LGBT people are the main users of public health system. Also, IMF recommended increasing cash transfers in response to the pandemic, but only on a temporary and target way, even knowing this occurred before the labor market fully recovered. In Latin American countries during 2020, the countries that most invested in social protection were Chile, Bolivia, Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina. Also, IMF recommended reduce non-priority expenditures. During 2020, IMF recommended to 12 Latin American countries to do this. They never specifies what this means, what non-priority expenditures means, but in general, countries tend to include here expenditures related to access to justice and protection in case of violence against women and LGBT people. Also, the IMF recommended reduce subsidies to public services, and this recommendation was made to 7 Latin American countries. As I said, women spend much more percentage of their incomes in this, and this increased the burden of care because now they have to get water or other energy sources more difficult. Also, IMF recommended freeze or decrease public sector salaries, and during 2020, this recommendation was made to 14 Latin American countries. And participation of women in the public sector exceeded 50% in many Latin American countries. Regarding the pattern of economic expansion, this is an impact not usually analyzed by literature, but it is very important. The strategies to increase GDPs for decrease the weight of fiscal deficit and free resources to pay could be of 2 kinds: short, medium term, or structural or long term. Regarding the first one, the post-pandemic recovery strategies, not only in Argentina, but I would say in every country in the world, had to do with public investments in construction sector. In Latin American country, in fact, the activity that had grown the most by mid-2021 with respect to pre-pandemic levels was construction, which is as you might guess, a highly male-dominated sector. As you can see here, this is the percentage share of women by economic activity in selected countries of Latin America in 2020, and construction sector, the participation of women in construction sector goes from 2% to, I don't know, 6 or 8%, which is the highest level of participation of women in construction sector. So governments are fueling an activity that is highly male-dominated. Regarding structural and long-term strategies, the recommendations of international organizations are usually linked to elimination of capital controls, trade liberalization, deregulation of productive activities, and less state presence in production. This bias towards openness and deregulation pushes countries to specialize in activities that are currently the most productive. In Latin American countries, had been developed 2 main growth strategies since 30 or 40 years ago. One of these strategies is extractivist model of development, mainly in South American countries, and maquila industry or maquila model, mainly in Mexico and Central America. These two models have a differential impact against women in terms of employment, in terms of burden of care, and in terms of violence. Regarding employment, as I showed you before, there's a very low participation of women in all commodity sectors. Here you can see agriculture, mining, and gas and water supply. These sectors have a very low women participation too. And this is what extractivist models are based. And in Maquila model, it employs a lot of women, but this labor insertion is precarious with very low wages and with a lot of violence and etc. Regarding care burdens, limited access to certain natural resources, either due to contamination or direct blockage by industry, could increase the burden of care for women. And also, in case of illnesses by contamination, women have to care, so it increases also the care burdens. And finally, regarding to violence, highly masculinized environments in extractive projects has increased the traffic for sexual exploitation of women, and cases of this were reported in mining areas of Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, Guyana, and Venezuela. And in Maquila model also, it has been well documented the increasing in trafficking of women for labor exploitation in these industries in Mexico and Central America. Regarding structural reforms also, here we can agree that some structural reforms are needed. As someone, I guess Alicia said before, a structural reform of tax structure is needed, but the ones recommended by international organizations have to do not with more progressive tax structures, but with the objective of fiscal adjustment and increasing competitiveness. During 2020, IMF recommended 38 countries to reform their pension systems towards privatization, and 32 countries to undertake labor reforms towards flexibilization. And women, as I said, are overrepresented among retired population and informal workers. To conclude, I mean, it's not a conclusion, but some final comments. I think Latin American countries don't have right now problems to generate foreign currencies. As we saw in many presentations, the prices of our exportations are on the roof. But the problem is these foreign currencies go to debt repayments. And I think international financial organizations must bear the risks they take. And if those risks are realized, as it happened with the case of Argentina, they must also give up something, interest or principal or whatever. So I think that would be all. Thank you very much.